You already know how powerful the Portuguese and the Spanish empires were. One was the first global empire and one of the longest that have ever lived, and the other, one of the biggest and most powerful in human history. But every time you look at a map, you begin to wonder, why didn't Spain conquer Portugal? After all, Spain was bigger, richer, and more populated, while Portugal was simply surrounded at the corner of Europe with no other neighbors, apart from no other than one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. If you would like to support the channel, make sure to check out our merch in the first link in the description. Now back to the video. Trust me, it wasn't from lack of trying. Portugal and Spain, also known as the Iberian brothers, like the name suggests, behaved like two teenage brothers, always fighting. Portugal kept resisting invasions from his big brother and lived in constant stress and fear that Spain would march their troops to the border. But it wasn't all that bad. The people of this peninsula divided the world in half and conquered everything they came across. Most of the time, they respected each other and focused their attention internationally by creating empires that stretched across the globe and had unbelievable power, one that they can only dream about nowadays. In this division, with the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope was a parental figure in the relationship. Him and the Church were the ones that kept the mutual respect and values of these two, allowing them to expand and spread the word of Christianity across the world. The fact that the two have similar languages, culture, values, geography, and history among other things, one can only imagine how it would be if the Portuguese Empire joined with the Spanish. What if these two magnificent countries were united under a single flag? This idea might seem outlandish at first, but what if I told you that it has happened before? But first, a bit of history. In a nutshell, the peninsula first appeared on the records mainly with the Phoenicians that built trading ports there 3,000 years ago. Then, they told the Greeks, who eventually led the Romans to invade it and decimate the Celtic populations like the Celto-Iberians and the Lusitanians. After that came the Germanic invaders, like the Visigoths, who occupied the entirety of the peninsula and made their capital Braga. Then came the Muslim army, that occupied almost all of the territory except the northern mountainous regions in Spain. Centuries later, the famous Reconquista started, where Christian kingdoms started to take back the peninsula, and the map looked like this. By the beginning of the 15th century, 4 kingdoms were dominant. The Kingdom of Castile, that was permanently united with Leon ever since 1230, the Kingdom of Aragon, that had territories in eastern Spain, south of Italy, and all the islands between Barcelona and Naples, the Kingdom of Navarre in the north of the peninsula, and the Kingdom of Portugal, that already had most of the islands in the Atlantic and territories in Brazil. Over the years, some marriages were arranged, alliances were forged, and all of the territories were united to create the Kingdom of Spain. All except one, Portugal. The Portuguese population, who proudly called themselves the Lusitanians, in honor of the brave ancient civilization that fought off the Romans, for one reason or another, always managed to become independent and resist the union with the Spanish kingdom. Always with bigger armies, they tried multiple times to cross the border and go for the capital, but every single time they got not only defeated but humiliated. It seemed like no matter what the plan was, the Portuguese people were always a step ahead and used their brains over their muscles to fend off the Spanish invaders. If you're a history nerd, you're probably angrily correcting me in the comment section already, but don't click enter just yet. Yes, there was a time where Portugal and Spain were united under a single flag. In 1578, King Sebastian of Portugal decided to invade Morocco with the backing of his uncle, King Philip II of Spain. The Pope and the Catholic army also supported him, but unfortunately he died on the battlefield. Sebastian was last seen riding headlong into the enemy lines. The worst part is that he didn't have any heirs, so in the following years his uncle Enrique tried to keep the country together, but after only 2 years he mysteriously perished. Interesting, right? But it doesn't end there. For much of Spain's fortune, Philip II inherited the Portuguese throne in 1580. Coincidence? You see, once the body of Sebastian was recovered from Morocco and sent back to Portugal to be buried, it could not be identified as Sebastian's, which left some people unconvinced of his death. Small resistance groups were created and fights initiated, with a curious one being the Battle of Salga in 1581, when the Portuguese people in the Azores didn't accept the Spanish throne and fought it until exhaustion. Luckily, they had a good navy, a strong port, and a lot of forts, but eventually they fell. Despite all of this, the mystery still remained, and a myth was born, claiming that the King Sebastian would come back to Portugal on a foggy morning to save the country from all of its problems. But I digress. Between 1580 and 1640, the entire Iberian Peninsula, as well as the Portuguese overseas possessions, were under Spanish influence, with the House of Habsburg, Kings Philip II, Philip III, and Philip IV had different characteristics, as you can imagine. But none of them seemed to get a hold of the Portuguese. Initially, things started pretty optimistic, with the Council of Portugal being created in order to let Portugal keep almost total autonomy. But local and overseas possessions and authority of Portugal were left to the Portuguese for most of the part, although this would quickly prove to be insufficient in many ways. Prior to uniting with the Iberian neighbor, Portugal was an impressive and actively expanding colonial empire with its own set of enemies and allies. But after coming under the crown of the Spanish king, the enemies of Spain became the enemies of Portugal. This meant that even one of Portugal's oldest allies, England, whom had been locked with a treaty since 1386, was suddenly no longer friendly towards Portugal or its overseas possessions, and neither were the French or Dutch, who began repeated attacks on the Portuguese colonial interests and territories. This stirred up significant concerns about the efforts of the Union in Portugal, and the death of Philip II in 1598 showed the Portuguese that their fears may have been more valid than they realized. Following the monarch's passing, his son, Philip III, took the throne of both Portugal and Spain as anticipated. While the new Philip wasn't necessarily a bad king, he was not quite a good one for the Union, as it was apparent from early on that he favored Spain in many ways, and he failed to even visit Portugal himself until 1619. As you can imagine, these weren't the brightest years for the Portuguese people. Taxes were raised to help with Spanish expenses. Animosity severed between the people, and the initial support from the Portuguese nobility and politicians was starting to fade away due to them being slowly replaced with Spaniards. In the beginning, Philip II did leave Portugal largely independent within the Union, barely merging the navy with Spain. But later on, the Spanish crown started to push an agenda to make Portugal equally as financially and militarily responsible for participation in the Spanish wars as the Spaniards themselves. The Dutch started attacking Brazil, English privateers began looting Portuguese cargoes, and the French crown took the opportunity to expand their influence in Africa. The Portuguese suffered all of the problems of being with Spain by inheriting Spain's enemies, all with no advantages. Things kept getting uglier between Spain and Portugal as time passed, and external conflicts turned into internal pressure between both empires, reinforcing an anti-Spanish sentiment in Portugal. As you might have guessed, things didn't last for long. The Portuguese people got sick and tired of the Spaniards. Bad management, lack of representation, and sense of superiority left the Portuguese people feel like they had enough. So when the Catalan revolt erupted at the other end of the peninsula, this prompted a sudden reaction from the Portuguese, who knew that now would be the perfect time to make their own move against the monarchy. Violence broke out in the peninsula, and with the help of England and France, Portugal quickly crowned João the Duke of Bragança as the new king of Portugal and managed to resist Spanish invasions. The declaration of sovereignty triggered the Portuguese Revolution War that would last until the signing of the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668 and would consist of repeated small border skirmishes occasionally interrupted by important battles such as the ones at the lands of Elvas, Ameixal, Castelo Rodrigo, Montes Carlos, Vila Nova, Berlengas, and Montijo. Most of these larger clashes resulted in Portuguese victories. France also supported revolts against the Spanish rule in Catalonia and Naples in the following years, while Spain, on the other hand, backed French rebels in a civil war known as the Fronde, and both also backed opposing sides in the Piedmontese Civil War. As eternal rivals, the two empires kept fighting on different sides on multiple occasions throughout history. Fun fact: Portugal and Spain never settled this feeling and resentment, and as you can tell from the huge amount of castles on the border, Portugal managed to maintain one of the oldest borders in the world. These constant conflicts and on and off wars lasted from the creation of the crowns in the 12th century right up to the 20th century. Yes, you heard me right. Not too long ago, Spain did consider invading Portugal twice. The first one was during World War II, when Hitler and Franco met and the issue was discussed. It did not go forward, probably because Franco asked for too much aid and Hitler was busy in other matters. The second one was after the Carnation Revolution in 1974. Franco was very worried about the left-wing movements in Portugal, especially the Communist Party, and started contingency plans to invade. But apparently, the Americans did not give the green light, but more on those in a later video. During the old Iberian Union, the flag adopted by it was simply the flag of the Habsburg house. Boring, isn't it? And also a bit unfair, so I have decided to create some alternatives. Feel free to pause the video and let me know in the comments down below which one is your favorite. Anyways, so why did the Iberian Union fail after all? It seems as though the Habsburg monarchs favored Spain far too much, causing the Portuguese to feel more under the occupation of Spain as opposed to being united as one. Possibly, if the kings had done a better job at creating a fair and equal relationship defending the Portuguese interests overseas, the union could have worked or at least lasted for longer than it did. Which makes me wonder, what would an Iberian Union look like nowadays? Could it become one of the major players in Europe and challenge Germany and France to the seat of power in the EU? Make sure to follow the channel as I will try to answer that question in my next video. Obrigado.